Picture this. A man at your doorstep, 3 hours after curfew. He lifts his hat as if asking for coin and mercy both. Out here, a hand on the latch could be mercy or a summons to trouble. And the night, as always, kept its judgments to itself. The latch rasped like a dry throat. Etta Calloway kept the kettle on the iron, felt the house answer in the low hum of settling wood. From the kitchen, she heard the hinge, measured the footfall. Slow, uneven, as if hunger had carved out the rhythm of his bones. She opened the door into a face more bone than flesh. The smell of him was smoke and sour leather, and that sourness which comes from not sleeping on a bed for too long. His eyes were sunken so far they looked like promises moth-eaten at the edges. He held his hat with both hands, palms cupped around it as if the hat contained the only warm thing left in the world. "Please," he said. But it was the sort of please the frontier had a name for, a currency no woman could count on. Etta did not invite him in. She stepped aside and shut him under the lamp's bow. Behind her, upstairs, the little girl's breathing was even. A small, persistent life that made the decision louder. She ladled stew, beef, what little meat remained, turnips, the last of the cornbread, into a tin plate. He ate with a kind of quiet that made the spoon sound like a treason. Between mouthfuls, he watched her hands. She watched the brand on the meat bucket as she scooped, the red scorch of cattle irons remembered in her mind. And then his wrist moved, and there, pale and old as a scar, was a brand she knew the shape of before she knew the man. A mark from Harlan's outfit, 2 crossed arrows. She had seen that brand burned into calves, on gates, on the flanks of horses. She had not expected to see it on flesh. It held a history, a reason, a clock. "Where'd you come off?" she asked. Her question picture this. Lanterns ringed like low moons in the arroyo. Boots thudded soft against sand. A man spat and laughed once. Out here, a hoofprint could tell a life's whole direction. And up in the loft she watched, hand on the sill, while the night held its breath. She pressed her forehead to the rough plank and listened to syllables the dark spat back. Low, measured, the way men count risk. The loft smelled of linseed, dried sweat, and the thin dust that lived in their cotton. Below, a lantern bobbed inside a circle of men. Their shadows ate the far wall of the arroyo. "Calfskin's gone good, if we move light," one said, the words thick with tobacco. "Meet at Miller's Bend at first light. 2 hours before sun. No stragglers." "He's supposed to be with them," another answered. "Supposed to bring the bay. We don't take turns on promises." The widow's fingers tightened where the wood split. Her knuckles left white crescent moons. She had no business listening. No business at all. Yet she had heard the man's pleading face earlier. The way his jaw had been more bone than man. How he ate as if he could not remember the future. She had given him bread and the last of the stew, and a little water warm to the point it did not sting him. She fed him because the widow's code was a muscle still, sore but honest. A horse's spoor cut the arroyo's bank like an exclamation. She had watched horses all her life. The spacing of the prints, the strain of the flank, the wobble of a hoof that carried an old nail. This track told a small, private truth. It matched the bay she'd seen drinking at the trough, one shoulder higher than the other. One broken shoe that struck the mud and splashed in a way only she had seen. Her feet found the rafters by memory. She slid down the ladder with a sound she meant to make nothing of. A single loose rung complained. The girl, her neighbor's niece, asleep in the downstairs bed beneath a wool blanket, rolled, not waking. The widow tucked herself into the shadow of the rafters, head bent so the lantern light at the arroyo could play over the hollows of her face and not reveal it. "What of the brothers?" a man's voice asked. "You said they had dealings with him." "Dealing changes hands. the other said. He's no fool. If he rode out alone, he means one thing or another. Either he's with us or he's with the law. A laugh, a clink of a tin cup. The widow could imagine the circle. Faces drawn in like the banked fire, breath warm, hands resting on gun butts for the sake of muscle memory. They spoke of rendezvous like men bargaining over a cow, as if names could be stamped and passed along without the living inside them. Her palm went to the sill and braced. The spoor ran toward the river ford, then forked. One set toward Miller's Bend, another toward the old gravel road winding past the wind-killed cottonwood. The man she had fed had chosen. Night had already folded his choice into a single trail. She tasted iron on her tongue. Mercy felt suddenly like a hinge. She could climb down, leave a kettle to boil and a note, warn him as only a woman who had warmed his bones could warn. Or she could let the spoon cool and keep the house whole, keep the girl safe and the land as quiet as a wound. A swig of whiskey. Someone's cut the air. If he brings the bay and falls in with Jackson's bunch, we finish before breakfast. No witnesses, no talk. The widow felt the loft's plank under her knee shift with a small, honest complaint. Her hand curled around the splintered rail until the skin split. She had fed him out of habit, out of a grief that still remembered her husband's hands. She had not bargained for a spoor that would lead to men shading the night with lanterns, for promises that smelled like gun oil. She could hear the bay's prints in her head, each a heartbeat, each a choice. The night was no longer only cold and wide, it was a narrowing. She smelled the stew, the iron of horse sweat, the tobacco. She felt the girl's slow, even breaths below like a tether. If she stepped out onto the stairs now, she would step into a river of consequence. If she stayed, she would be keeping a hearth while something she had fed might ride into a trap. Her thumb rubbed the fresh, ragged edge of her nail where it had split on the rail, and she realized the stubbornness of her small humanity wanted to move, not because it was right, but because it could not bear to be the same after. She listened again. "Meet at Miller's Bend," the voice said, final as a door. 2 hours before sun. She could follow the spoor, or she could hold the girl in the house. Either choice would undo something. The ladder creaked beneath her weight, an honest sound announcing a decision she had not yet made. Picture this. Her fingers around a tin cup, the rim leaving a pale crescent on knuckled skin that still wore the husband's ring. Horses snorted in the yard. 2 figures cut through the dry light like knives. Out here, a man coming back to family could mean sanctuary or summons. Their boots hit the porch and the air changed. Hospitality had just become evidence. They did not come as robbers. They rode like men who had learned to look for promises where others saw only dirt. The taller one dismounted with a slow, polite motion, leather creaking. His face carried the flat weather of someone who'd worked a river claim and lost. The other, younger, jaw set, kept his hand near a holster that did not tremble. "Mrs. Harlan?" the taller asked. His voice was low and old country ready. He said her name as if testing it for weight. The widow set the cup down. The girl, small, knees knocked with a child's habit of being busy where danger brewed, had pressed herself against the stove and watched the men like a bird. They laid a roll of papers on the table. The paper smelled of smoke and coal and a county clerk's ink. The top page, folded twice, bore a scrawl she recognized in the slant. Her husband's hand had signed it, once, many moons ago. The younger brother kept his mouth a hard line. The older watched the girl. "You fed a man last week," the older said. "Word got to us, we followed. Our boy's out there." He jerked his chin toward the yard where other riders leaned on saddles, faces hidden by shadow. "They're the muscle. We're here on kin business. That ranch, your claim. It was promised to family." Her throat tightened. Promised. The word opened pain like a trapdoor. Her husband had once muttered promises in the cold, pledges that burned like coal in the mouth and went to ash with the next frost. She had taken up the land believing the world had no use for promises after the illness took him. Promises were scents. They could be tracked. Law? She asked. Jacob's brothers did not laugh. The older produced a paper with an official stamp, an agreement, notarized, bearing the name of a man who could not be summoned back from the grave. He promised his share in case a man had to choose. We come for what was pledged. We come to take care of what's kin. The younger brother's eyes flicked to the girl's hair, to the ring on the widow's finger. We don't want blood, he said. We want the land. We want the boy's offspring kept right. The country had its own mercies. Keeping blood in its right place was one. The widow felt the rifle from the lean-to in the next room like a weight that answered her every old fear. The girl began to tremble. There was a movement, a quiet action. The older brother slid one boot off, set it against the threshold as if testing which side picture this. Her thumb came away stained with ash. A curl of charred paper clung to the nail as if it would climb back into flame. Out here, a burned word was a debt, a promise, or a threat, one and the same. And the night was far from over. She didn't set the lantern down. Light trembled on the iron of his rifle when she drew it from the chest, caught the tiny, familiar nick behind the bolt where he'd once tried to fix a stubborn ramrod. The wood smelled of old sweat and linseed. The metal wore the dull patience of use. She let the butt rest against her thigh like a living thing. With one hand, she worked the paper apart. The edges blackened and flaked, leaving a soft dust on her palm that tasted of smoke and something sweeter. Ink, she thought, or perhaps the last of his whiskey. The letter had been half consumed. Sentences collapsed into silence. A name was whole enough to stab. Tobin. A figure she knew by gait and the way he laughed through his teeth. Beneath, a phrase. Picture this, a hand at the lip of the well. Small, caked with blood and dust. The rope bit into Martha's palm as she hauled the pail. The girl's fingers barely curled around the rim. Out here, water was mercy and confession, and a girl's silence could be trouble harder than any rustler. And the brothers were coming up the ridge. The girl leaned over the stone, hair a mat of straw and tar, one cheek streaked with a pale bruise where a horn had grazed her. Her mouth opened like a well that could not answer. She breathed shallow, as if the earth itself had stamped the words out of her. Martha let the pail swing and took her coat off, Tom's, threadbare at the elbow but warm, and settled it about the girl's shoulders with hands that did not shake but had learned to be precise. She stripped 2 thick slices of bread from the pantry, tore them in halves, and fed the girl by degrees. The bread tasted of last week's corn and something sweeter. Tom's tobacco smoke that still lived in the larder. The girl's hands took the bread like a child remembering how. Her jaw worked, but no sound came, only small, hiccuping sobs. Martha wiped the dry blood from behind the girl's ear with her sleeve, smoothed a mat of hair back, and felt the deep, hollow ache grief had hollowed into other people's faces. From the rise of hard-packed earth came the clack of hooves. 2 horses, 2 men. The brothers had the gait of men who measured land by fences and favor by footfalls. Silas dismounted with a slow motion that said he had time for argument. Abner rode on like a question that needed no answer. They took in the girl in the doorway with the quick appraisal of men who could read loss as ledger. "Whose child?" Silas asked, not unkindly, but the care in his voice was a calculation. Out here, kin carried claim. Kin had a way of knotting people to each other, names that could be used to lay hands on stock, on plow, on women and boys too young to refuse. Martha did not look away. "Neighbors," she said. The word hung like smoke. Telling it the neighbor's name would set a geography of duty. Not telling it would invite suspicion. She had no papers to show, no marriage bond that could make one person another's. Mercy in Martha's life had already cost seed and the calf that never grew. Picture this, sundown slicing the yard into blade and shadow. A colt thumped the rough-hewn table so hard the coffee jiggled. Out here, a pistol on a board was as binding as a judge's word, and the night's business had only begun. The bang had the shape of a promise. Men who had ridden hard that afternoon still sat with dust in the creases of their shirts, their hats not yet lifted. The brothers, Amos with the careful shoulders of a man who knew covenants and county lines, and Ben, whose jaw looked ready to close on a fight, stood opposite a ring of the widow's visitors. At the middle board, the gang's leader, a lean-twisted man named Reese, let the colt fall into his palm, then slammed it down so the iron spoke loud as a bell. Martha Hale kept her palms flat on the table. Her knuckles were work-whitened, her wedding band gone decades before, a small empty socket on the third finger. The girl, Maggie, 15, hair braided and frayed at the ends from chores, stood behind Martha, fingers hooked into the apron, eyes like a sparrow. Legal reckoning, Amos said, slow and dry. If a man is accused, he answers to the law. Hand him over, or we take measure ourselves. You'll have the county's weight behind it. Reese spat into the dust. Law don't answer bullets once they're loose. This man's run to your bunkhouse. You hid him there while the rest of us were out. Hospitality's sacred till it protects the guilty. Which is it, Martha? Words folded into threats. A horse stamped outside. The bunkhouse door, a rough plank way back by the corral, seemed 100 heartbeats away. Men leaned forward as if they could pull the answer out of the widow's throat. Maggie swallowed. The smell of coffee and horse sweat and warm leather braided with the iron grease on Reese's pistol. Something in Martha's face went still and very old, as if she were counting debts the land had taught her to keep. Feed the passing stranger, but not at the cost of your own skin. If he's in my house, Amos said, the law like an affidavit on his tongue. You hand him out. We'll bring him to town. If you hide him, we take measures to root him out. You know how that finishes. Ben's hand drifted to his belt. Reese's men shifted their weight as if to test the reach of everything tied to leather and iron. One of them, short and wide-shouldered, reached to the table and tapped the Colt's cylinder with a finger. The metallic click sounded softer than the slam, but meaner. Martha felt the click under her ribs. She had once opened her door to a dying man and bled with him until the fever passed. She had also watched men come in recompense for debts and leave with a burnt granary and a child's cradle splintered. Hospitality was a law older than county courts here, but hospitality had killed people too. Bring him out then, Reese said. If you won't, we'll take what we need. We don't want a burnin', but we won't be ashamed to use it. Maggie moved, then froze. Martha's thumb brushed the spot where her ring would have sat, feeling for a phantom weight. Her eyes fell to the bunkhouse window, gray with the last light, the latch plain and within reach. Behind her, the girl's breath caught like the first cold of coming winter. Outside, picture this. Moonlight pooled in the corral like ink. A man spat blood into the dirt and tried to smile. Out here, a cut mouth was less shame than warning. And the night had not finished measuring her. He spat, a red arc that caught the moon and fell in a slow, ugly bead. The bowl in her lap trembled. Flour dusted the room like cold smoke. The girl folded her hands so tight the knuckles shone white. On the far wall, the rifle leaned against the cradle where a man who was no longer coming had once slept. The cowboy smelled of horses and old tobacco. His lip was split so the wound showed his teeth when he tried to grin. The grin was a map of someone who'd learned what it cost to ask for mercy. He reached for the bread without looking, fingers that shook because hunger had its own rhythm of shame. You were gone a long spell. the widow said. Her voice was not soft. She was a woman who'd fed cattle through winter and knew the weight of a question before it landed. Where'd you get that cut? The man laughed once, a sound that had more gravel than humor. He wiped his mouth the way a man wipes a lie. Corral fight. Got in a tangle with one of ours. Thought I'd make it back by supper. Thought wrong. He looked at the girl, then at the widow. There was a steadiness in that look that unsettled her. Not arrogance, but an exhaustion that had learned to ask for what it needed. I wasn't always like this, he said. The boys, sent me. Said they'd see if the widow on the ridge would feed a starving man and maybe let more through. The kitchen smelled of beef fat and wood smoke and something iron from his mouth. The widow set the bowl down, the wooden clack loud in the hush. Sent you? She kept the ration of surprise measured. Surprises in that country had teeth. They wanted to know if you'd open the gate to any man with a belly and a story, he said. If you'd hide him, if you'd stand for him. There was a truth in that confession. Tests were a kind of currency. Ranch brothers measured loyalty and weakness the same way they measured fences. A woman alone was a ledger. What she paid with kindness might come due in men with knives. He pictured this. A tin cup slid from her fingers and struck the packed earth floor like an accusation. A horse nicked gravel. The deputy's shadow crawled up the porch. Even his spurs seemed to say sentence. Out here, mercy was a currency and debts were called in with lead and kin. The law had just come asking to be paid. He did not dismount slowly. He stepped down with the quick, careful gait of a man who had learned when to speak and when to show his hands. His badge was a thin coin of brass, dulled by rain. He had the first 2 buttons of his coat undone, as if hospitality were too great an affectation for a man who kept judgment in his mouth. You've sheltered a man, he said, and the words were neither accusation nor question but a ledger. He eats your bread. I can take him away clean, reckon the brothers go home. Your place stays whole. Hand him over and there's a truce on the books. The widow's spoon hung in midair. The girl, her daughter, not yet a woman, stood behind her, palms clenched to the hem of the widow's skirt. From the kitchen, a thin smell of burnt coffee curled against store dust and the pressed wool of winter. Behind the widow, the barn door breathed. She knew the cowboy lay somewhere under old sacks, the fever in him low and roving. The elder brother did not wait for the deputy to finish. He leaned forward so his hat rim cast his eyes in shadow and said the words that had unmade the man the widow had loved. Honor don't live on bread or in the law. Your husband's name. It means kin repay kin. We have a right. He's either turned himself or he pays. His hand fell flat on the table with a sound like a gun being cocked. Shelter ain't mercy when it betrays the family. The younger brother's jaw worked. He had the kind of quiet people mistake for thought. He spoke like a horn that always sounded after some other note. You keep him, and you teach our kin to be soft. That's how men get killed twice, once by guns, once by forgetting why they carried them. The deputy's offer was practical cruelty. His truce was a hinge that would swing either way. He named terms. Hand him over before dusk, and he'd file no papers against her. Refuse, and he'd read her to a justice who liked spectacle. He did not say what would come if the brothers took action themselves. The widow looked at the 3 men in the room, and then at the girl. She saw her husband's boots propped by the stove in memory. She saw the burned rough of a letter she'd kept folded under a nail. The letter his brother had thrown away in a fit of rage. She felt the weight of the spoon in her hand as if it were a weapon or an altar. Where is he? The younger brother asked, and the question was blunt mercy. Find him and make it right. She could see the cowboy's boots under the hay in the barn, the way the fever made him cough until the ribs showed like a map. She had fed him thin soup and wrapped his wound. She had given up a blanket for him. Each act had been ordinary, water, bread, shelter, until the world rearranged them into treason. The deputy's eyes flicked to the child and then to the widow. He had the look of a man who would split a woman's choice in half if it meant keeping a town from burning. The brothers had the look of men who would pick at that split until it bled bone. Outside, a wind moved the laundry, a dry, thin sound that might have been a prayer or a warning. The widow set the spoon down with a deliberate, small noise. She did not rise. She did not give a name. She felt the law and the kin and the shame like separate hands on her wrist. The girl watched her face like someone reading a map she could not yet follow. There was a moment so narrow that it could hold a lifetime. Hand him over and keep the roof. Keep the legal name. Keep him and lose what the brothers promised to take. Or split the difference and betray both mercy and memory. She tasted iron in her mouth and thought for an instant of the burned letter under the nail. What it said. What it was meant to protect. Her throat made a sound she tried to call a laugh and failed. Every code in the room pressed toward one direction. She reached into her pocket and touched the cold band of metal at her finger. And for a second, the room was only the weight of things. If she turned the cowboy over, she would hand the brothers the right name and keep a house whose corners would watch her as if picture this. The wind writes names in the snow. Barbed wire held white like teeth. The fence whispered. Out here, a writ nailed to a door was declaration, not accident. And the ledger lay open on the stoop like a loaded hand. Her hand, mittenless, pressed to the girl's fevered brow as if she could smooth the heat away by force of will. The child's breath made little huffs in the cold kitchen. Steam braided up from the last cup of broth on the stove. Outside, snow sat on the barbs and did not slide. It kept whatever lay behind it prisoner. She rationed by the rule her husband taught her with a Bible tucked under his arm. Not charity, not cruelty. Calculation. 2 spoonfuls for morning, 3 for noon, 4 if the child coughed at night. The sack with the last of the beans was a thin, patient thing, and every handful she measured felt like stealing from a future winter. When she had bartered half a bolt of cloth to the tanner for broth the week before, she had tasted the economy of favors. A man's favor bought a day's heat. A woman's favor bought a night's rest. Now the books had their turn. They arrived with the sky already closing down. 2 brothers, one with his hat pulled hard and ice on his whiskers, the other with cheeks hollowed by travel and eyes that kept snagging on the child's cot. The older one slapped the ledger flat against the plank porch as a saloon hand might slam a deck of cards. Ink took to the page like blood. Names, dates, marks where the dead could not sign. "We ain't here to bleed you," the older brother said, ledger cold. "We're here to settle accounts. Surrender the one you keep under your roof, or we start the possession ourselves." He tapped the paper. "We'll file. We'll bring men to take possession by winter law. Possession's proof out here." The quieter brother looked at the girl, and the look on him was soft and dangerous at the same time. "He was my brother," he said, not to excuse but to explain. He had no kin to see to this. If she stays, she'll be kin again. We'll see she has what she needs. And the claim keeps the home from strangers. There was a truth in that. Property in these parts was not only fences and ledger lines. It was the guarantee a name stayed where a body had lain. He said it as if a mercy might be folded into seizure. For a breath, the widow saw a version of herself, older, kinder, handing the girl over and keeping the house, keeping the title, keeping the land because the law would nod and the neighbors would say she did the prudent thing. It almost felt like a way to survive. She put the ledger down as if it were a living thing and picked up her husband's old wedding band from the mantel, testing the weight of refusal. They wanted the girl, but they circled the house because they wanted the land more. A staged seizure, a declaration filed, men to stand on. Picture this. A rifle across a widow's lap, oil catching lantern flame like a small, slow dawn. The brass where a man's thumb had worn it was bright as a confession. Out here, a promise could be carved into wood and kept truer than a judge's word. And the road beyond the corral whispered feet that would not keep waiting. She unhooked the ramrod as if moving a spine. The stock fit her the way a memory fits a palm. Scarred, warm beneath the rag with the faint sour smell of old sweat and horses. He had oiled it after supper in winter, muttering of belts and sights, and how a rifle was a household thing as much as a kettle. Tonight she felt the shape of those evenings in the hollow of the butt, like a name being spoken back into the house. When she found the small notch behind the wrist, his mark for zeroing, her chest closed. His promise had been simple as a ledger entry. If they come for the land, you hold it, not for me. For what we started. He had said it once, a long breath and a half smile, as if teaching her to read a line on a map. The words weren't law, but they had weight. She kept them like a weight on the tongue. She wrapped a patch and drew it through the bore until the rag came away the clean gray of late rain. Steel tasted of copper and wet iron. Each stroke unspooled an image. Him on the porch, boots pushed off the rail, his hand on the rifle while he listened past the corral to the long quiet. He would have laughed at her now, her fingers too small for the guard. But the laugh would have been the kind that steadied. Outside, the wind made the cistern sing. She slipped the lever, felt the smooth click of cocking, and set the sights at a tin can on the far fence post. The same can they used to feed the dog, dented and faithful. She loaded one round because she had learned from him that less was more when measuring resolve. One shot would tell her all she needed and risk the least. When she stood to aim, the air took the breath from her. The land lay flat and indifferent. The moon hung low and thin. She pressed cheek to wood and let muscle remember what grief had forgot. His voice came back. Breathe slow. The first breath was a remembering. The second was a promise on paper burnished by iron. The trigger broke. The rifle barked like a sudden barn door slamming. The can jumped, silver scattering, and for a single wild second she imagined the sound riding out across scrub and mesa like a bell. Her hands shook, not with recoil, but with something that felt like taking a step across a threshold. A laugh answered from down the wagon track, low and clipped as a blade. She froze with the rifle at her shoulder, the smell of burned powder sharp in the dark. Footsteps stopped. A shadow tightened against the scrub. That laugh had no surprise in it, only a patient calculation. Quiet thinned into a thing about to snap. The rifle was still warm in her palms. For a breath, she considered returning it to the corner, oiling the metal smooth and honest, letting the promise be a thing kept in memory only. The land waited. The road waited. And from the dark, the brothers' patience readied to be spent. The bullet's bark rolled across the mesa. From the mesquite, a man spat a laugh like a match struck. Knees in shadow, the brothers had heard. Her night of practice had become their notice. Picture this. The hired hand pinched out his lantern and let the light die between two steady fingers. A horse stamped, a shadow slid along the corral rail like a knife. Out here, a man's word could buy his life or sell another's, and the night was not yet done. Tommy Rusk moved like a man used to slipping between chores and trouble, his boots whispering over frozen, churned earth. He had been with Martha Keene 2 seasons, mending fence, breaking colts, and carrying a laugh that made the work lighter. He carried things in the marrow of him, debts, a child's cough, a promise to a sister he fed with store credit. The Grady brothers had put coins in his palm and a map on his palm the color of old blood. When they left, they said they were looking for strays and owed men. They did not look at Tommy, but they did not have to. Caleb Reed lay in the hayloft, the straw-cutting patterns across his cheek where he had slept in fits. He had eaten at Martha's table because she gave food like a quiet law. He was thin as a promise, but steady, eyes awake in the dark. He heard the first step and took the rifle from where it leaned cold against the beam. Outside, a lantern clicked dead. Inside, the world narrowed until breath was loud. The door shuddered. Timber gave a note that raised every hair by the throat. Voices. Gideon Grady's slow, practiced, and Abel's higher, quick as a nail. "We'll call," Gideon said. "You come out and no one needs to earn more death." They had reasons. Old land deeds, a brother's burial gone wrong, honor tied to shackled mortgages. But those reasons were tidy things clipped to violence. Tommy's shadow fell across the threshold. He did not look at Martha. He had never been cruel in the small ways that made a man, but his face was hollow with an equation. Coin plus family equals choice. He mouthed something that was not a beggar's prayer. It was nearer to apology. Then he turned a lantern, and the light cut the rafters like a question. The world swung. Caleb fired once, not because he wanted to, but because the rifle made a choice for him. The bullet found boot, then flesh. Tommy's hand jerked, and the lantern went. Picture this. A piece of paper, creased and stained, dropped on the kitchen table like a verdict. Steam climbed from a tin cup. The girl's hand trembled where it rested on the widow's knee. Out here, a signed scrap could mean shelter or a flat grave for a name. And 3 men waited for an answer that would not be undone. Her thumb found the ink as if it might still bleed. Jonah Carver pushed the note forward with a knuckle. The paper had been pressed thin by sweat and time. The blacked loop of a signature, H. Boone, was unmistakable under the dirt. The words were small and precise, the sort of careful handwriting a clerk would teach a man who'd never had cause to learn it. For value received, security picture this. Hoofbeats like a slow drum around a house that will not keep secrets. Lanterns swung, oil pale and patient, as men tightened their circle. Out here, a ring could buy a body or a truce. Mercy was a currency as scarce as rain, and the night was far from over. Her thumb brushed the cold gold, and the girl's knuckles went white around it. No first words. Only the small, stubborn sound of a child clinging to the last thing that belonged to a father. The widow watched without looking away, the way a surgeon watches an uncovered wound. She set her palm flat on the table, feeling the rifle's wood beneath bruised skin, feeling the heft like an oath. Outside, horses shifted. Leather creaked. A hoof struck stone 3 times. Then a muffled laugh, the kind that pretended it would take no pleasure in what it meant to take. The brothers had learned the country's grammar. Surround, call, barter, take. They knew the language that made women into things to be reclaimed. They knew the way a widow's shoulders narrow when she is measured for the price of survival. She moved with the economy of a woman who had kept a ledger in her head through lean winters. A blanket rolled into wedges. A chair upended against the back door. The girl stayed close, ring clenched to her breast as if it were a bone. The widow lifted the rifle, thumb finding the hammer's notch. The metal sat heavy in her hand, years of muscle memory from a life she had not planned to finish in this way. A voice, not the youngest, not the leader's, but steadier, called from the dark. "We don't want blood tonight, sister. Give us what's ours. John's debt. The land. You give, and the boy." He paused. The pause was a ledger's ink drying. "You give the girl to kin, and we leave." There was the justifiable rot in it. The brothers' hunger braided to honor as they spoke. The widow tasted grief like iron in her mouth. Her husband's name in their mouths was a tool. Their law had the old righteousness of men who keep accounts by the ledger of kin. To hand over the girl, to hand over the ring, would be to sign away the last mercy she could give. The girl's life under her roof. To refuse would be to invite blood. The choice tightened in her chest, a vice that would not loosen. She remembered her husband's face the night they wed, stern, tired, glad. and the way he had looked at her when he promised the ranch. He was not here to trade on that promise. The rifle hummed its own counsel. Outside, a lantern raised like an accusation. Shadows leaned together, waiting for the widow to be less than what she was. The gun was an ugly honesty. She could load it, she could fire a warning, she could throw the ring into the open and hope men took mercy. None of those choices kept the girl whole. None of them kept the land. She rested the butt against her shoulder, sighted along the iron, and felt, absurdly, the architecture of the night settle into the barrel. One life framed in the crosshairs. She knew the sound the gun would make. She knew the silence that would follow. She pressed her eye to the stock and let the breath go. The report cracked, sharp, personal, and the world narrowed to a single falling shadow and a girl's hand letting go of gold. The house exhaled, lanterns flared, a horse screamed. Men swore in different voices as men do when they realize bargains have been broken. The widow stood with the rifle still warm against her cheek, the echo inside her ribs louder than any shout. Outside, the circle broke and reformed like breath. In the doorway, the girl stared at the dark stain that might be a man or might be a shadow. The ring lay where fingers had loosened it, catching lantern light as if nothing had happened. She had chosen. The cost had not yet come due. The brother's justice was a thing that pictured this. The rifle's walnut butt seared into her shoulder. A man stepped out of the circle. His spurs sang like a verdict. Out here, a single crack could settle kin and claim land more surely than any lawman. And the night was nowhere near finished. Her finger found the trigger as if it had always been there, as if the rifle remembered her husband's hands. The lead brother walked slow, a swagger like someone testing whether fear would fold first. Men and horses ringed the yard, lantern light slicing faces into parts. Jaw, eye, the white around a mouth gone small with hunger or purpose. The girl hid behind the tack chest, one hand clamped over her mouth, breath hitching in tiny broken rhythms. The widow smelled sweat and horseflesh and the iron tang of blood before she felt it. Her left hand tightened on the forestock. The wood was slick with dew and dust. The man said her name, no softness, almost as if asking permission. She could hear the others drawing like a rope. The quiet click of fists loosening on knives and the rattle of a lariat against a belly. For a slow, sacral second, she saw the brother's face as it might have looked in sunlight. The same crooked scar over the brow that her husband had once joked about. The same slant to his mouth when he smiled like a boy. Memory hit like cold water. Mercy and the rifle sat on opposite hips of her chest. The shot was a hammer, all at once. A blue flower of flame, the report folding the night. Bones made a sound when they broke inside skin. The lead brother doubled, then went down as if the earth itself took him. Two sharp thuds, the lantern at his knee guttering. A red bloom opened under his shirt, bright on the dust. She had not meant to see the look that came after the life went out of him. Not anger, not surprise, but something like apology, as if he were finally noticing the wrong he had done to himself. Her hands moved of their own accord, the left one reaching for him, grease-stiff hair slipping between her fingers. Blood slicked her palm, warm and impossibly loud. It was the first thing she touched that was not just an object to be managed. The girl screamed then, not from grief alone, but because safety and terrible cost had arrived at the same instant. The sound cut through the stunned hush like a saw. Men around the ring blinked, their faces reshaping into fury. The brother at the far gate spat curses, and a pistol rose in an unsteady arc. Boots scrambled. A rope sang as it was thrown. The gang closed ranks with animal speed. The widow straightened, rifle steady though her arms shook. She smelled gunpowder and iron, and the sharp, clean smell of a life ended. Her throat was full of words she had no right to speak. Men she had known as threats now had a new fact to reckon with. She had killed one of their own. The girl clung to her skirts, wet-hot sobs burning into the fabric. For a heartbeat, they all waited. Posses do not go to war without counting the cost. But the waiting broke like ice. Someone cursed and ran. A horse reared and stamped. The brothers converged with the momentum of a thing that had decided what it wanted. She had cleared the circle. She had made herself impossible to go back to. The yard smelled of blood and gun smoke, and the dead man's face hovered in her mind like a map she could not read. What she had bought with that single shot was raw and immediate and terrible. Breath for the girl, murder for a brother, and the knowledge that nothing would be the same. She lowered the rifle as they lunged, and with blood warming her palm, understood the single, unbearable truth. She had traded her name for this moment, and the ledger would demand its reckoning. Picture this. The wedding band slipped from her thumb and vanished into the brazier's mouth, a tiny metal last swallowed by orange teeth. Smoke pulled at the rafters. The claim papers crumpled, ink hissing like wet grass. Out here, burning a piece of paper was not panic, but law. You erased proof and made a story harder to follow. Voices from the corral, low, animal, and angry, spoke of retribution, and night held its breath. She did not kneel to the flames. She stood with a length of paper between two fingers until the heat stung, and the ink ran black like a river of old promises. Each scrap caught and folded into itself, the burned letter's edges curling away from the writing as if the words were trying to climb back into her chest. The ring glowed red for a second, then was gone. The loss sounded small and enormous all at once. The girl's hand found the back of her skirt and clung there, nails clean from a life that had known less mud than these hands. The widow felt the child's grip as a vote that weighed more than any ledger or law. She thought of the dead brother on the lean of the wind, his necklace of dust and blood across the yard, and she thought of the two left who would keep the accounting by other means. Behind her, the older brother's silhouette moved by the stables, the younger swearing soft and mean. They had a right by their measure, a name to defend, a kin's land to reclaim. Their faces were not carved from malice alone. They were bone and stubbornness, and the honest belief that vengeance would stitch their world back to how it had been. That honesty made them dangerous. She shouldered the rifle, leather scraping her hip. It was not elegant. It was the only argument she could carry that might buy the time for a night's riding. The horse stamped, smelling the smoke, ear twitching toward the voice of the man who'd once called her sister-in-law. The animal understood threat as well as hunger. "Make for the ridge," she said, and her voice did not tremble. The girl's small arm looped once around her waist and found the pistol belt at her hip, fingers fumbling at the buckle as if discovery might slow them. The widow saddled the stubborn mare. Iron creaked, and for a moment she remembered the first saddle she had bought. New, proud, and how different pride looked then. She threw a final handful of the burned letter fragments into the brazier. Ash rose like a brief, dead flock. For a second, she wondered if she should leave a match to the house itself, let it burn as carefully and as loudly as a court sentence. But she did not. She left the house standing, crooked and stubborn, a thing that would witness consequences. Better, she thought, that the men have something to aim their anger at other than a smoking ruin. A place to rage against and remember. Horse beneath her, the girl clamped to her back. The widow nudged into the lane. The brothers' shouts came not as a single gun, but as a chorus of gravel and promises. She heard the scrape of a boot on the porch, an oath, and the hollow animal sound of a man making himself hate. They crossed the corral gate. The mare threw its head. The widow kept one hand on the saddle horn, the other braced on the girl's small shoulder. She felt every yard of the land as a ledger erased. Fences, the well, the place where the husband had been buried, all becoming things she was abandoning not with triumph, but with a calculation that had the bitter shape of mercy. As they moved away, the smell of smoke shrank to a candle's wick. Behind them, the wind carried a question she could not answer. Whether the two living brothers would come like law or wolves. Whether the road would teach the girl to shoot or leave her to be taught by kindness. Out there, the horizon was not a promise, but a demand. She had traded a name and a roof for a saddle and a secret. The cost stood like a silhouette at the gate. A brother's corpse, 2 vows of blood, and a paper ash that had once been every right she could show the world. They rode into the dark with the mare's breath steaming, the girl's head on her shoulder, and the widow's jaw set around the choice that no one could undo. Behind them, the ranch smoked. Ahead, the road did not promise mercy. Only motion and the shape of what must be done next. The brothers' horse hooves were a slow drum in the valley. Their voices, close now, carrying the name she'd burned, promised return and reckoning. She had nothing left to prove here. She had everything to lose on the road. She did not look back. The night took them. In the small pocket where she had once kept her claim papers, ashes trembled. In the girl's hand, a sliver of a burned letter smoothed between thumb and forefinger like a confession or a prayer. They crossed the ridge. The ranch became a dark smudge.